I first heard Doug Dick speak in April of 21 when our Presbyterian did a wonderful series on mission. And then this September, if you remember, we had Reverend Zumat, and he, as a Presbyterian peacemaker, and he spoke about the Palestinian Christian community very emotionally, and we got inspired to learn more, read several books, and then we reached out and saw we have a mission coworker right there in this area. It's a very complex area, very chaotic, as you can imagine. And so Doug is going to share with us what his life is like and how we can support him. I hope each of you picked up one of these. He's a great photographer, so there are a lot of photographs there. And also, as you leave, if you'd like to pick up a prayer card, I have them over there on the side. You can put them on the refrigerator, put them in where you pray, just to keep him in mind. And he'd like you to save the questions to the end, unless you just have to ask one, and then he'd be open to that. And it's all yours, Doug. Thank you so much for taking this time with us.
Thank you. Well, thank you for having me this morning. It's actually about 2 minutes after 4 here, and I'm actually in the little town of Bethlehem, which is where I live.
Wow.
I was in Jerusalem this morning for church, and came home then after church, following church at St. Andrew's, which is the Scots Memorial Church, and got home about 2 o'clock and rested a little bit before our time together this morning. I currently serve with the Presbyterian Mission Agency in a role that's called Regional Liaison to Israel, Palestine, and now Jordan. They've added Jordan back to my repertoire. So, and I served in that capacity from 2004 until October of 2013. And I've been in the Middle East for 24 years as of this year, with the exception of 4 years back in the United States from the fall of 2013 until the fall of 2017, taking care of my mother until she passed away, and then not really knowing what I wanted to do with the rest of my life. And my former area coordinator, who was based here at the time, said, "Your old job is available, you have to apply for it." And I said, "Well, I don't know that I really want to return to the Middle East. I hadn't really thought about it." But in the end, it was the right decision. So in November of 2017, I returned, and I'm in my second 4-year contract with the Presbyterian Mission Agency. So that will take me to almost to the end of 2025. We say about our time here that we are here at a critical time, and that we are a critical presence at this critical time. And there's something biblical about that. And you can read my newsletter this month, which I just sent off on Friday. So it should be being posted to the website probably within the next week or two. But this is also an Easter message from Jesus Christ himself. "And you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem and in Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the earth." So we are here at a critical time, and we'd like to think that we're a critical presence. And we want to come alongside our partners, our Palestinian partners, and our Israeli partners that are working for peace. One of our primary concerns is to support the Christian community, which is Palestinian and Arab, here in the Holy Land, because they are the community that is basically being marginalized and diminished. And we also want to participate in the life and the liturgy of the church here in the Holy Land in whatever capacity we can. Now, I participate in the life and the liturgy of the Church of Scotland, which is not one of the 13 traditional churches. However, they are the church that sponsors my visa to be here. So every year that has to be renewed through the Israeli Ministry of the Interior. And the Church of Scotland, or St. Andrew's, Scots Memorial Church in Jerusalem, was not really built as a church that would have a weekly congregation. It was built as a memorial to the British and the Scottish soldiers who fell in Palestine during World War I. So it was built between 1927 and 1930, which means that in another 7 years, that church will celebrate its 100th anniversary. So it's a relatively young church, when we consider all of the other churches and their traditions here. As Presbyterians, we partner with both the Anglican or the Episcopal Church, the Episcopal Diocese of Jerusalem, and the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Jordan and the Holy Land, or the ELCJHL. And we partner with those because they run some of the best schools and some of the best social service institutions in the Holy Land. And while they do cater to the dwindling Christian community, the majority of the recipients of their services are largely Muslim. And so they engage in a pattern of service which they call witness through service. In other words, in this part of the world, it's not easy to talk about your faith to people that are non-Christians. For example, in Israel, it's against the law if you want to proselytize to someone or convert them. You could be deported for doing that. And likewise, to the Muslim population, it's inappropriate. So you have many doctors, many nurses, many teachers working in hospitals, in schools, in clinics, that let their lives demonstrate the love of Jesus Christ to them. And so we like to come alongside these schools, these churches, and these institutions and partner with them. And we use the term partnership very loosely because oftentimes partnership is more in kind than in cash. But occasionally we are able to provide grants or small amounts of money each year as those institutions make known to us what their needs might be or what their needs are. So this is one of the things that we pride ourselves on doing, that the Presbyterian Church does not have a presence here outside of our partners or our partnerships. So they are our address here in the Holy Land. Another opportunity that I have is to speak to and to host Western visitors or Christian visitors that are coming to learn about the contemporary situation here in the Holy Land, particularly for the Palestinian Christian community. And again, as I've told you, that is the community that is being marginalized and diminished. We can talk about issues such as the Israeli occupation of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. We can talk about land confiscation, house demolitions, et cetera, et cetera. But in addition to that, we can actually take people and show them where these things are taking place so that they can see for themselves. And again, there's something biblical in that. You know, again, in the season of Easter, what did the angel say to the ladies that came to the tomb on the first morning? Come and see, and then go and tell. So this is our desire, that people will come and see and then go and relate their experiences when they return home. And we hope by doing so and by providing these unique opportunities, this will amplify the voices of those that are seldom heard or are never heard. We also like to facilitate face-to-face meetings with between tour groups or church groups and both Palestinians and Israelis that are working for peace and justice. So in other words, I could talk ad nausea for several hours about the situation, but I think it's much more interesting for visitors to meet Palestinians and to meet Israelis firsthand and hear what it is that they have to say about the conflict. So again, providing unique opportunities of getting those pilgrims and tour groups down and off the bus to meet with real people that make their homes and their lives here. We also think it's important that when Christian groups come to the Holy Land, they spend adequate time in the West Bank, such as Bethlehem. And Bethlehem is a Palestinian city. There are no Israelis living in Bethlehem. So by spending 2 or 3 or 3 or 4 nights in Bethlehem at a hotel, it's providing a much needed income to the Palestinian community and to people that work in those hotels, whether they be working in the restaurants, the bars, whether they're cleaning staff, tending to rooms, et cetera, front desk people. But that provides a much needed income. And during the years of the pandemic, Bethlehem suffered greatly. I mean, so many cities around the world did. Many cities or many places in Jerusalem also suffered, and inside of Israel. But for Bethlehem, which is a city that depends on tourism, it was very hard hit. and weren't seeing any tourists and pilgrims coming. But having people coming to Bethlehem, spending a few days in Bethlehem, it also provides an opportunity for Palestinians to market their goods, their wares, their souvenirs. And in Bethlehem, there are two big industries. One is olive wood. The number one is olive wood. And some of you may even have olive wood nativity sets or creche sets, whatever, that were made in Bethlehem. And the second one is mother of pearl, which was a craft that they say was introduced to the area by the Crusaders. So this is a mother of pearl is basically a shell, and the shells were imported, and then carvings were done from the mother of pearl. A significant portion of what we consider to be the Holy Land today lies in what is today the West Bank, or the Israeli occupied West Bank. And so it's very important that people come to the Palestinian areas and see for themselves and live it and experience it. I'm going to give you an example. A year ago in February, I had a pastor friend whom I credit with actually getting me involved in mission service. She and her husband had done mission work in Costa Rica, and they knew of my love and my interest in the Middle East. I had spent some time at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem studying archaeology and Arabic prior to coming and working for the Presbyterian Church USA. So she was coming on a Holy Land tour with an Israeli tour agency. And I told her, please send me a copy of the itinerary so I can look it over. And when she did, I actually wasn't surprised. And I said to her, you're not going into any of the Palestinian territories. You're not even coming to Bethlehem. And you're not going to meet any Palestinian while you're here. So she wrote back and said to me, well, how about if I extend my stay and spend a week with you? And I said, that would be great. So she did. And subsequently, we took her, of course, she got to see everything in Bethlehem. She got to see the shepherd's fields in Beit Sahur. We took her to Jericho. And she would say to me every morning, I'm getting angrier and angrier because of what that young Israeli tour guide, and it was a female, it was a woman, told us about the situation in the Palestinian territories. And of course, my friends who are Palestinian, both Christian and Muslim, would jest with her and say, don't you feel uncomfortable here? Don't you think we're threatening you? But she had a really good time, and her eyes were opened, and she did go and tell of her experience. Another unique opportunity that I have is to talk about my life and about the situation for Palestinians living in the territories. As Beth said, I like to do photography. I do a lot of photography and take a lot of pictures and share those with the denomination. And if you go onto my homepage of the Presbyterian Church, you'll see many of those photographs. The church expects us to write 4 newsletters a year. And I think when they send the newsletters out, the hard copies, to people who have signed up to receive them, usually there's 1 photograph that's featured on the newsletter, but they allow us to have 10 photographs on the website or on our homepage on a carousel. So if you go onto the electronic version of the newsletter, you'll see that I always send 10 photos to sort of illustrate the newsletter that I've just written. Of course, ultimately, we want to change the hearts and the minds of people when they come here and give them a different idea of who Palestinians are and of who Israelis are. Unfortunately, the Israeli narrative has always dominated or dominates much of the Western understanding of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So we think it's important that when people do come to the Holy Land, they meet with, they talk with, they spend time with Palestinians, and they get to know them, and again understand that there is another narrative here. In terms of the situation today, we're now about 28, 29 years after the Oslo Accords were signed. How many of you know what the Oslo Accords were? You can tell me with a show of hands if you know. This was the peace agreement that was arrived at in the early 90s between the late Yasser Arafat and the the state of Israel. And the whole idea was to end hostilities, and there was going to be a mutual historic reconciliation between the two sides. The situation today is that there are still the unresolved issues, which at the time they said were the most difficult issues to solve. And those unresolved issues are Jerusalem, who controls Jerusalem, who owns Jerusalem. Israel says it's eternal, indivisible capital, and the Palestinians want East Jerusalem, or the old city, as their capital. The situation or the issue of water. Water is a resource that's very limited here and in short supply and is not shared equitably. So the issue of water has yet to be worked out between the two sides. Israeli settlements. You have, I forget what the number of Israeli settlements is in the West Bank, but you've got something between 600,000 and 1 million Israeli settlers living beyond what's called the Green Line. And that was the 1949 armistice line that existed between what became the state of Israel and Jordan, because the West Bank was Jordan up until 1967. So, and those settlements are expanding today. And as you probably know, that the West Bank represents 22% of what is left of historic Palestine. This is what was negotiated in the Oslo Accords, that this was supposed to become the Palestinian homeland or the Palestinian state. So in the West Bank, you have something like 4.5 million Palestinians living. In the Gaza Strip, you have about 2.2 million Palestinians living. And again, I've already told you that there's between 600,000 and 1 million Israeli settlers living beyond the Green Line in the West Bank. So they're living amongst the Palestinian population. So you can imagine the tension, you can imagine the atrocities that take place between the two sides. Palestinian refugees is another final status issue. In 1948, when Israel was created, there were upwards of 750,000 Palestinians that were either forced from their homes and their villages or fled out of fear. And something like 415 Palestinian towns and villages were simply leveled. They were bulldozed and razed to the ground. So you have Palestinian refugees worldwide today, the majority of whom are dispersed, but Jordan plays home to the largest number of Palestinian refugees. You have Palestinian refugees in today what is Jordan, in Syria, in Lebanon, in the Gaza Strip, and then worldwide. So how do you begin to think about compensation for the refugees? The refugees claim that they want the right to return to their homes and to their lands. And the second part of that, of course, is compensation. How would compensation or compensation could certainly go a long way into resolving that issue. The final borders of the state of Israel, and there was just an article in the Israeli daily Haaretz about this just a day or two ago, talking about what are the borders of the state of Israel. The late Yitzhak Rabin, who was assassinated in 1995 by an extremist a Jewish radical religious person, stated when he was asked, where are the borders of the state of Israel? He said, the borders of the state of Israel is where the Israeli army now stands. So at the time, of course, the Israeli army was ensconced in the Golan Heights, which is Syrian territory, the Gaza Strip, which was part of Egypt at one time, and fully in the West Bank. So Israel's borders are still rather fluid and still haven't been fully set. And of course, one of the issues, there's actually a sixth issue, and that is the Palestinian political prisoners that are serving time in Israeli prisons. When Israel arrests a Palestinian on suspicion of carrying out an attack or of being guilty of planning an attack, they can be put in what is called administrative detention. That means that the person is not allowed access to a lawyer, not allowed access to their family, and they can be held in administrative detention not only once, but the administrative detention can be overturned. So there are many Palestinians serving time in Israeli prisons that have their administrative detention over they have it extended. So they're still serving time in administrative detention with no due process of law. And this is the sixth issue that Palestinians feel need to be addressed in any final status or any final settlement with the state of Israel. Of course, COVID-19 came. I just mentioned that, and again, it affected tourism greatly here, as it did so many of the major tourist destinations around the world. At first, there was cooperation between Israelis and the Palestinians. Israel agreed to be the guinea pig for the world during the COVID pandemic. So in exchange for being the guinea pig, Israel was given the vaccines. And I made the decision to not return home. The Presbyterian Church gave us an option. They really wanted mission personnel to return home, or you had to come up with a contingency plan for how you were going to take care of yourself if you stayed and if you stayed put. And I made the decision to stay here. So I was completely vaccinated in an Israeli hospital while I was here. I received all 4 vaccines here. The Palestinians were given the vaccines a little bit later. And the way that worked out was Israel would have so many vaccines left at the end of the day, and they would basically summon people to the checkpoint and say, because they have a very good intelligence apparatus, so they knew how to contact everybody and said, come and get the first dose of the vaccine, or come and get the second dose of the vaccine. And they would allow them across the checkpoint to be vaccinated on the Israeli side of the checkpoint. I've already told you about the population, but the only thing I want to say about that is, you know, the populations of both peoples are almost at par. I've said there are 4.5 million Palestinians in the West Bank, 2.2 million in the Gaza Strip. But if you take the 20% of the Israeli population who are Israeli Arabs and add that to the population of the West Bank, that means that the Israeli Jewish population and the population of Palestinian Arabs is almost at par. And I'm talking about between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. So this is one of the things that that needs to be considered when you think about resolving the conflict. Is there going to be one state? Is there going to be 2 states? What have you? I think I'm going to just talk about a paper that I've just recently written about. I entitled it "Some Truths About the Israeli-Palestinian Conflict." And I'll mention the population thing again, and then I'll wrap it up, and then I'll give you time to ask questions. And this shouldn't take too long. In terms of both Palestinians and Israelis, neither side knows or understands the history of the other. This is the conclusion that I've come to, and I've heard others say this, but I can, this is a reality, and this is a truth that I can live with, and it's true. The Palestinians don't know much about the Holocaust, and by the same token, the Israelis don't understand what happened to the Palestinians and what they call the Nakba, or the catastrophe that befell them when the state of Israel was created. Now, you may recall that the United Nations voted to partition Palestine in 1947 into an Arab state and a Jewish state. It's said that the Jewish side agreed and the Arabs disagreed. And according to the partition plan, it would have given the Jewish state much more land than was relevant to the population at the time. So the Arabs rejected it, and then this is when war broke out. So again, on May the 14th, Israel declared its independence in 1948, and Palestinians refer to May 15th as the Nakba, or the catastrophe. I've already given you the statistics about the number of people that were displaced and the number of towns and villages that were destroyed. For Israelis, of course, it's the persecution. Their history is the persecution and systematic annihilation of the Jewish population of Europe in what we today know as the Holocaust and the Second World War by Nazi Germany. 6 million Jews were rounded up and slaughtered and massacred by the Nazi war machine. Again, not knowing, not understanding the history of the other. Now, that's not to say that there's no one that understands the history of the other, but I'm speaking of in general, that you're dealing with two populations that have been traumatized. Another thing is there's no trust of the other. Israelis believe that the Palestinians and all of the Arab neighbors, meaning the Arab countries around Israel for that matter, are out to annihilate them. And for Palestinians, they believe that every act of expulsion, every Palestinian death, every land confiscation, every house demolition, every settlement construction is a continuation of their catastrophe that started in 1948. And we can see examples of this today in a place near Hebron called Khan al-Ahmar. No, excuse me, Khan al-Ahmar is on the Jericho road going towards Jericho. Masafar Yatta is in the Hebron area. But these are Arab Bedouin communities that Israel is trying to forcibly displace, either to just simply get them out of the way, or in the situation of Masafar Yatta, they want to make a firing zone in the area where these people currently live. The mutual historic recognition as set forth in the Oslo Accords in the 1990s, of course, is for all intents and purposes dead. And in my opinion, it's ludicrous to continue to talk about a two-state solution, because if you look at what's happening on the ground today, I don't see it. The window of opportunity, I feel, is closed. And I think in the end, what will end up happening will be one democratic state from the river to the sea with equal rights for all. That might be a pipe dream, but I don't see any other way. I don't see Israel pulling out of the West Bank and taking its settler population out of the West Bank. And I don't see Palestinians leaving of their own free will or being forcibly evicted again. The United States failed, as did other Western nations, in acting as the fair and even-handed broker for the Oslo Accords. And that was the only thing that sustained Oslo, was that all of these Western nations agreed to be the caretaker for the agreement between the two sides. In fact, United States foreign policy has never favored anyone but Israel in the Middle East. And so all during the Oslo years, Israel continued to build and expand its settler population in the West Bank. It did pull its population out of the Gaza Strip, but you had roughly 2,000 people, maybe, that were living in the Gaza Strip that were making the lives of upwards of 2 million people miserable. And the security that was required to take care of them and to look after them was a nightmare, I'm sure, for Israel. Again, as I've said, to continue to talk about a two-state solution, I think is ludicrous. This is something that Joe Biden still alludes to, President Biden, when he talks about the situation here. But if you look at the situation on the ground, where do you see a viable Palestinian state emerging? And there have been different scenarios discussed about that. Could the state of Palestine become a confederation with Jordan? Possibly, yes, because Jordan provides access across the Jordan River to Jordan. There would be a port at the Red Sea. There would be an airport, and there's no airport in the Palestinian territories. Israel wants the land of Israel as its own and claims that only Jews have a right to the land, which again entails Jewish supremacy. And we just heard this again just last week when Israel celebrated its 75th Independence Day, what they call Independence Day. Palestinians want all of the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, as the homeland for the Palestinian Arab people. Of course, now you have to add to the equation what we call Western fundamentalist Christian Zionism. You know what I'm talking about?
Indeed.
And this is basically a mindset, a thinking that the bloodier the conflict gets here between the two sides, they're convinced that the return of Christ is imminent. And so they're really not interested in any sort of peace agreement at all. They want to see basically Armageddon take place. Mainline Protestant church denominations such as the Presbyterian Church, the United Methodist Church, the Mennonite Central Committee, and others continue to be alarmed by the human rights abuses and the level of violence that is committed by both sides against the other. We continually issue statements as well as send fact-finding delegations to the region to see the situation for themselves on the ground. And again, as I said earlier, the whole come and see and then go and tell. I also mentioned earlier that both populations are almost at par. And this is something that should be a wake-up call for Israel as much as for the Palestinians. That between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, you have as many Arabs, Palestinian Arabs, as you do Israeli Jews. In 2022, it was reported that 6.8 million Jews and 6.8 million Palestinians live between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, which means that the population would be at par. I don't know where that stands today. I know that just last week, Israel issued new statistics for its population on the eve of its 75th anniversary. So with all of this in mind, how can we contribute to peace in this area? How can we be part of a peaceful solution and not become part that just continues to exacerbate the problem? The first way, and this is just a small list, I have a longer list, but I won't bore you with the longer list unless you want it later. We can help others to understand why there currently is no peace. You have to come and see for yourself. If you see the situation on the ground, you'll know, and you can see right away. I've worked with a number of African American groups over the years, and when they come, they see it right away. To them, it's very obvious. We have to uphold the principles of international law and the Fourth Geneva Convention, which holds each side to accountability. We have to recognize the rights of the Palestinian people to self-determination, as well as the right of the State of Israel to live at peace. We have to recognize that there is a power imbalance, and in this I'm talking about Israeli guns versus Palestinian stones. And pressure our elected officials to stop supplying arms to one side over another. And I believe that the Office of Public Witness, which is our office in Washington, D.C., recently issued a statement about that, basically calling on the Biden administration to stop continuing to supply Israel with weapons. The human rights and human rights law must be respected and be at the center of any future negotiations. To not turn a blind eye to the continued Israeli occupation of the Palestinian territories, including their lives and their livelihoods. To maintain a status quo that does not recognize the above will only continue to paralyze this part of the world and the region, and will not bring peace and security to Israel, nor self-determination, peace and security to the Palestinian people. And finally, I'm just going to say, if the window of opportunity is closing or has closed on the prospect of a two-state solution and the establishment of a Palestinian homeland, then too the window of opportunity closes on the notion that Israel will exist as a Jewish homeland for the Jewish people. So unless there is separation of the two populations, then Israel will not be that Jewish homeland for the Jewish people. It will become a binational state with equal rights for all. Call it what you will. And the very last thing I think I'm going to say, I'm looking at my watch. I haven't spoken for 50 minutes, but I think I'll wrap it up because you may have questions, is what does it mean for those of us who call ourselves Christians to walk in the footsteps of Jesus today? You know, we see a lot of Christian pilgrims coming here and they'll say, oh, we came to walk in the footsteps of Jesus. But what would that entail? In my opinion, it's not enough to just come and make a journey to the Holy Land and look for the sites and the places where Jesus himself may have walked or may have trod. I think we're called to a higher standard than that. And I think that we also need to think about where Jesus would walk today if he were here, and with whom he would walk, and with whom he would sit, and with whom he would eat, and with whom he would show compassion, etc., etc., etc. So for me, it's not about retracing sites that may or may not be authentic, but thinking about where Jesus would trod today, not only in this land, but in our troubled world. And finally, of course, you know that as Christians, Jesus calls us to love our neighbor, and he was serious about that. He meant it. So, how do we define neighbor, and how do we think about who is our neighbor, and how do we wrestle with that? If you want to think about ways that Presbyterians can continue to engage on Israel and Palestine, we have a very vibrant Israel-Palestine mission network that you can become a part of. I can send this to Beth perhaps later so that you all can have it. Number two, you can advocate for a just peace by calling or writing your senator or your congressperson, and by signing up to get those action alerts from our Presbyterian Washington office. It's called the Office of Public Witness. I get them, and I regularly send them to my senators. So, and it's actually very easy to do. You sign up for it. They'll send you the latest action alert. And then you have the option of, do you want an email sent or do you want a written letter sent? And then you get acknowledgement that it was sent with your name and your address on it. You can support one of our partner organizations here in the Holy Land, one of our churches or one of the other organizations through an extra commitment opportunity or ECO account, and those should be online. You can participate in a come and see trip to visit the Holy Land, and the next Mosaic of Peace trip that will be sponsored by the Presbyterian Peacemaking Program will be next February, early March. And I think we're going to do a Jordan extension again. It's a well-rounded trip. We meet with both Israelis and Palestinians. We travel the land. We spend time in the West Bank. We spend time here in Bethlehem. We go to the Galilee. We spend time in Jerusalem. So if you've ever thought of coming to the Holy Land and you want to do something that's much more engaging other than just running from holy site to holy site, you could think about that. You can support a mission worker, and unfortunately for you, that's me in this part of the world. Although, but we have mission workers around the world, and you're probably already doing that. You can sign up to receive my newsletters, and again, I think Beth can tell you how you can do that. You can become acquainted with what other resources we as a denomination have produced about this region and about the conflict. And I keep several of those here on my bookshelf, starting with the 1997 resolution on the Middle East. And then the Israel-Palestine Mission Network produced 4 very good resources. The first one was called The Cradle of Our Faith. The second one was called Steadfast Hope. The third one was Zionism Unsettled. And the fourth one was Why Palestine Matters, the Struggle to End Colonialism. You can become familiar with the churches of the Holy Land and follow their statements. And both the Archbishop of the Episcopal Diocese as well as the Bishop of the Lutheran Church here regularly issue statements, not only at Christmas and at Easter, but oftentimes depending on what's happening on the ground here. You can become familiar with Kairos Palestine and their Easter and Christmas alerts. Kairos Palestine is an organization that was founded, I want to say about 13 years ago, and basically it's a cry from the Palestinian heart to the world about their situation and their suffering. And they have a very good website, and you can follow what they say about the conflict. You can become or sign up for how to become a commissioner at one of our general assemblies, and maybe some of you have already done that in years past. And then you will have both a voice and a vote, and serve on a committee that makes key decisions regarding our denomination. And finally, you can write letters to the editor of your local newspaper advocating for a peace based on justice and fairness and rooted in human rights for all of God's people. And I think with that, I'm going to stop.
Well, questions. I have an extensive reading list. So if any of you want to read further, many of the resources he mentioned are in here, so grab it as you leave. Now, questions? Charlie?
It's kind of like two-part, it's not well-formed, but thank you, that was really interesting, because we all want to know what we can do. With Jewish friends in Tel Aviv, London, Geneva, where all the European Jews, I heard 20 years ago that there will never be a separate state because of the differing growth rates between the Palestinian people and Israelis. Therefore, there'll be an army from within, so no go. So you've alluded to the fact that there won't be a two-state solution, or you don't feel a two-state solution is possible. Is there any kind of reparations thing thought of that, you start just paying Jordan, there's 6.8 million people, the US has to take theirs, the English and the everyone must take 1 million, and then we pay, the ones that are holdouts, put them in Jordan and support, we were already allies with Jordan, but, is there anything going that way to pay to resettle and just have this full-on Jewish state versus that out? And then second, the weapons thing, as Israel being our, nuclear-tipped ally in the Middle East for all these bad actors and characters, we're not going to stop doing F-16s to Israel, you know what I mean? Maybe it's just, firearms and handheld weapons, but they aren't that expensive anyhow. So I'm sorry, that's a mess of things, but I just want to know if you know what's going on in that direction.
Yeah. Well, thank you for the question. In terms of reparations, it was United Nations Resolution 194, I believe, that basically called for the right of return for Palestinian refugees, or the right to be compensated for, again, their homes, their land, their properties, their livestock, what have you. And as you know, the United Nations, sort of like the Presbyterian Church's General Assembly, you can pass as many resolutions as you want, but you need a body to implement those resolutions. So UN Resolution 194 was never implemented. It was simply stated that the Palestinians have a right to return to their homes and be compensated for what they lost. Now, it's interesting because if you talk to Palestinian refugees, they have also been coming up with some creative ideas of their own about what those reparations might look like. And I remember some years ago, a friend of mine who dealt with Palestinian refugees and refugee rights was telling me that they had a conference at Tel Aviv University. Tel Aviv University, part of it at least, is built on the ruins of a Palestinian village. And apparently one Palestinian gentleman stood up and said, why would I want this beautiful campus and this beautiful university to be destroyed in order to implement a right of return? It's not possible. Many years have passed. But what if my children and my grandchildren and my great-grandchildren could come here and study as part of the reparations that I would have received? So again, that's something that's very creative. And again, they've actually thought of this, how to be compensated. Of course, oftentimes the refugee population and the refugee community, it becomes too easy to become a refugee because with that comes a certain status. For example, in the beginning, when the Palestinians became refugees in 1948, it wasn't until 1951 that UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, became operational. And what they did was actually provided cinder blocks and mortar and some corrugated tin for Palestinians to build these little 3-meter by 3-meter houses. UNRWA did not build them for them, but they provided them with the materials. And then they provided things like oil and in the beginning there was deliberate what do you call it, feeding of the population. Now today, only in hardship cases does UNRWA provide any sort of food, such as oil, flour, sugar, salt, things like this. But largely UNRWA, United Nations Relief and Works Agency, again, provides health services and education to the refugee population. So their mandate is not a political one, it's a humanitarian one. That has to do with the Palestinian population. In terms of reparations, I know that the Jewish community is still seeking reparations from largely Germany, and have been, to a large extent, successful in claiming reparations from the German government for what the Nazis did to them in World War II. In terms of weapons and arms to Israel, I don't see any American administration, at least in the near future, discontinuing arms sales to the Jewish state or to the state of Israel. However, that doesn't mean that we as people of faith or as Presbyterians shouldn't be calling for it and saying and recognizing that, selling arms or giving arms to the state of Israel continues to exacerbate the existing imbalance that exists between the two sides. Now, of course, we probably give arms to Jordan and arms to Egypt as well, and Turkey. So there's a business here. I mean, we have to recognize that it's not just Israel that's being armed by our weaponry. But that's going to continue to be a big issue, I think, for us to continue to monitor and to continue to say, that enough is enough. It's sort of like what you have going on with, I guess, with guns in the United States, isn't it? Although there you have people going in and buying their own. It's not like someone's arming the population. But in this case, we're basically, for many, many years, the United States wanted Israel to have a military edge against its neighbors. Yeah. And of course, as you know, the situation with like between Ukraine and Russia, where you have Russia threatening a nuclear war every other week, and the situation and the implications that has for this region of the world. We're seeing a lot of Ukrainians and we're seeing Russians here that are seeking refuge from that conflict in Israel. I don't know how they're going to be allowed to stay or how they're working out their situation, but we're seeing populations from both Ukraine and Russia that are coming to Israel and looking for refuge. I'm not sure I answered your question. I hope I did.
Thank you.
I have a question about a phrase you used. You mentioned the dwindling population of Palestinian Christians. Can you say more about that?
Well, by and large, it's the Christian community that has had contact with the outside world, unfortunately, through churches and missionaries, et cetera, et cetera. So, and it's the Christian population and the Christian schools that provide quite a good education to these young people. So immediately they make contact with the outside world. And then it becomes, where can I go to get a higher degree, such as a bachelor's or a master's or a PhD? And once those young people have access to the outside world, it's quite difficult for many of them to want to come back and live here. Many do, and they come back and serve their own population and their own people. But consequently, they know that they could have a better life and make a better income if they were living beyond the borders of the West Bank. So it is the population that is dwindling because of that, the Western contact with, or the contact with Western missionaries, Western churches, etc. And then again, you have many people that just simply want to leave because the situation here becomes intolerable or unbearable for people. The level of violence that continues to happen on a daily and a weekly basis. If you're and this is not just the Christian community, it's happening to the Muslim community as well. If you're a Muslim or a Christian from Bethlehem and you want to go to pray at Al-Aqsa Mosque, or for Christians, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and you apply for a permit, that's not reason enough for Israel to give you a permit. And this happens oftentimes at Easter, and we just saw this. I was speaking to several friends of mine. Israel will give permits to the Christian community, but they'll deny giving a permit to an entire family. So, for example, the husband might get it, but the wife won't. or the husband and wife will get it, but the children won't, or one child won't get it, but the rest of them will, et cetera, et cetera. So there are many reasons that permits are denied people, but the reality is it's not normal to continue to keep a population confined to areas such as Bethlehem, Ramallah, Jenin, Nablus, Tulkarm, Kalkilia, and these are the large Palestinian population areas. But you have to apply for a permit. The permit has to be granted, and Israel does give many permits to people. Some people have business permits and they can conduct business, but during the Jewish holidays, those permits are canceled, which means you're confined to the small area that you live in. But for example, I know many people that have not been to Jerusalem in more than 20 years, and Jerusalem is like 6 miles away from Bethlehem, and yet they haven't been there because they can't go. If you need a kidney dialysis and you need to go to Augusta Victoria Hospital, which is on the Mount of Olives, run by the Lutheran World Federation, or to the Makassar Hospital, which is also on the Mount of Olives, that's not a valid reason for asking for a permit. Israel doesn't have to give you a permit because you need a kidney dialysis. So there are many restrictions that contribute on a daily basis to the what is it I want to say, to the decline in the quality of life for people here. And all the while, Israel continues to settle its settler population in the heart of the West Bank. And this is a population that is largely armed. They carry firearms, they carry weapons, whereas the Palestinian population does not, largely. And so it has to do with the quality of life. It has to do with, if you're looking at the outside world, and if you have an opportunity to get out, do you really want to come back and live here and stay here? So it comes down to a personal preference, but it's not an easy place to live for many people. It's not an easy place to live.
I have a question.
Mona.
Are there universities in the Palestinian? Yeah. Okay. I want to.
Yes, there are. Yes, there's Bethlehem University. There's Birzeit University near Ramallah. There's An-Najah University in Nablus. In Gaza, there are 2 universities. So yes, there are institutions of higher learning in the Palestinian territories.
You mentioned before, I want to make sure I got this right, that there are a majority of Palestinians that don't understand about the Holocaust or don't remember it, aren't aware, and a majority of Israel that don't understand or remember about Palestine and what happened when UN created the nation. And if there's universities, is there not a free press? I'm just wondering how it is that people could live under such conditions and not understand how those conditions began. I mean at that kind of level.
Yeah. Well, I think it probably comes down to whose suffering is worse, yours or mine. So I don't want to say that they don't know, but there may not be an attempt to know. Now, and again, having said that, I know that there are many Palestinians that do know about the Holocaust, and I know that there are many Israelis who know what happened in 1948. And these are Israelis who are very left wing, very activist. They would show up at all of the demonstrations, particularly those happening in the country now against the current government's desire to change the Supreme Court, the power of the Supreme Court, etc. So I don't want to generalize, but at the same time, in general, I think that's the case. That there's not. Again, at the end of the day, whose suffering is worse, yours or mine? Yes, you suffered in the Holocaust, but at the hands of Nazi Germany, not at the hands of Palestinians. So why do I need to understand your suffering? That's a European story. That's not a Palestinian story or a Middle Eastern story. And by the same token, there are many Israelis who don't know what happened in 48. They think there was a war. The British left, and on May the 13th and May the 14th, Israel declared its independence, and end of story. But and throughout the land, there are many places where I can take you and show you the villages where the what's left of the village still stands. So it's well documented, it's well known. But again, I think at the end of the day, it's the understanding of whose suffering is worse, yours or mine. And you had these two catastrophes happening at the same time. I think in Hebrew, because Israel doesn't refer to the Holocaust as a Holocaust, but as Hashoah, and Shoah also translates to something like catastrophe. So for the Jewish population of Europe, the Holocaust was a catastrophe, and the creation of the state of Israel on what became of what was historic Palestine was a catastrophe for the population. So it's, yeah, I mean, I'm as I said, I don't want to generalize, but at the same time, that's really a basis for where we begin. Whose suffering is worse, yours or mine?
Yeah, you have a question.
I think most of us know how the impact of weapons coming from the US. Which other countries are also supplying weapons to Israel, and who's on the side of the Palestinians? And are they supplying weapons and things?
That's a good question. It's a two-part question. There's no one supplying the Palestinians, to my knowledge. However, there was a Jordanian that was just caught at the border last week trying to smuggle weapons, they said, to the Palestinians through the Allenby Bridge crossing. And when I've raised this issue with my Palestinian friends, they're like, there's something very suspicious about this. What kind of car was he driving that he had 200 handguns in this car? I said, I know, the story itself sounds suspicious. What kind of car was he driving that he could smuggle all these weapons, number one? And number two, why did he think he could get by with it? You know, what was he thinking? So, but by and large, most of the weapons coming into the West Bank are being supplied through Israel. Now, these are people that are who are either dumping the weapons in the West Bank, or criminal elements that know how to sell weapons to the Palestinians, et cetera, et cetera. In terms of Israel being supplied weapons, yes, it's not just the United States, but Israel has a very large weapons industry itself. Israel supplies much of the world with weapons. And produces weapons. So there's just a lot of weapons on the market. Yeah. What we're also seeing, and this is a relatively new phenomenon, but within the past 2 years, there's been a lot of Arab on Arab violence in Israel proper, and I'm speaking mostly in the Galilee region, where you have these gangs or this family, or in Arabic, it's called hamula, which means clan. These large clans that are feuding with one another and are basically shooting and killing one another. And I forget what the number of people that have died already this year in that violence is, but it's staggering. And this is a population that's heavily armed and that's carrying out retribution against one another within the Arab community. And that in and of itself hasn't been addressed by the community. So there's just a lot of arms here. There's a lot of arms.
Everywhere.
Yes.
You had a question.
Is there any hope for equality for the Palestinians under a one-state solution? I was in apartheid South Africa just before my trip to Israel. Now, when I got to Israel, I thought, here's apartheid all over again. Where's the American indignation? And they're obviously, the Palestinians are treated as second-class citizens. Will they continue to be?
Yeah. Well, Palestinians who live inside of Israel will tell you that they're second and third class citizens within the state of Israel, in terms of housing, in terms of job opportunities, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, if you add to that Palestinians living in the West Bank, you can just imagine, because they have no rights under Israeli law, they're not citizens of the state of Israel, they're citizens of the Palestinian Authority or the Palestinian territories. And so that's a totally different dynamic. But in terms of whether or not Palestinians living inside of Israel would have equal rights, if there were a one-state solution, I mean, I think it's inevitable. You know, again, Palestinians living inside of Israel, I'm talking about Israeli Arabs, or they would call themselves Palestinian Israelis. They are citizens. They can serve in the Israeli army, and some of them do. Not many, but some do. So they have more equal rights under the law than anyone living in the West Bank. But still, as I said, they see their situation as being second and third class citizens. I just took a picture in Jerusalem last week or 2 weeks ago during Ramadan, and the same thing happens at Christmas. There's this big banner that goes up that says something like the state of Israel would like to wish its Muslim residents a happy Ramadan and an Eid. It doesn't call them citizens, it calls them residents. And it's referring specifically to the populations in Jerusalem. And Palestinians living in Jerusalem have a special status. They are residents, but they're not citizens. And at one time, I know their ID cards actually said resident alien. So if you're a Jerusalemite, you have to apply for what's called a laissez-passer if you want to travel abroad. It's a travel document, basically. And you also have to have papers from the Ministry of the Interior, the Israeli Ministry of the Interior, that gives you the permission to return. Because if you leave without those papers, you could be denied returning to the country of your birth. So it's quite staggering, the laws that are already in place that prejudices the Palestinian Arab population. And at Christmas time, the same banner goes up. The Jerusalem municipality wishes its Christian residents a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year, but not citizens. It's Christian residents. So people living in Jerusalem have, again, that special status, which entitles them to the national healthcare system, which is not a bad thing. And this is why Palestinians living in Jerusalem are not willing to give up that status, not willing to give up their Jerusalem ID. So, for example, if a man marries a woman from the West Bank, a Palestinian man marries a woman from Bethlehem, he has to apply for what's called family reunification. In other words, he wants to bring his bride to Jerusalem to live with him, but he'll have to apply and wait for the approval of family reunification, which might come and which might not come. If a Palestinian man from the West Bank marries a woman from Jerusalem, a Palestinian woman from Jerusalem, I mean, normally the woman would go and live with the man, right, in the West Bank, but she would be very reluctant to give up that status. So again, if she wants her husband to come and live with her, she'd have to apply for family reunification. And the likelihood that she would give up her status because of the national health care, that's like that's like gold. You know, I mean, you live in the United States, you know what healthcare costs. So, and it's basically free. It's free healthcare that's provided by the state. So the likelihood of giving that up would be slim to none. Did I answer your question in a roundabout way?
It verifies. Yes.
I'll try to quick, but so there's kind of like this unwavering support of Israel, especially by like the American Evangelical Church, and I just feel like a lot of those people don't know that by doing that, they're pushing out Christians. So it's Christians supporting oppression or whatever against other Christians. I feel like they don't even know that. So
Yes.
what can we do to educate more people on that? It's like the Israeli narrative, especially within the evangelical church, is the only one, but they don't even realize it's actually persecuting Christians. I don't even think they know that there's a population of Palestinian Christians.
That's right. We actually have a working group on Christian Zionism that I'm a part of, and every month to 2 months we have a meeting. And that's one of the things, I mean, that's the topic that we're trying to deal with, and we recognize that that's a big problem. You know, you also have to understand the rather twisted logic of Christian Zionism. because there's no Christian love being demonstrated to the Jewish people in that either. Because the thinking is that God is ingathering the Jews into the land of Israel so that 3/4 of them will be annihilated. And the remnant, the last fourth, will convert to Christianity. The Messiah will come. Boom, end of story. So, and the state of Israel and many of the prime ministers have known this, that there's no Christian love being demonstrated to the Jewish people. But in the short run, there are benefits to be had by allowing by allowing these groups to continue with this thinking. I'm talking about the John Hagees and the others, that come and bring thousands, if not millions of dollars and thousands of pilgrims to the land, and basically get to do what they want, and the narrative gets blurred. And I mean, it's a very twisted logic. I mean, in my opinion, Christ will come in his own good time, and the Bible tells us that of that day and of that hour, nobody knows. But in the meantime, our role should be to usher in our lifetimes, the kingdom of God in our midst, and allow people to see a foretaste of what that would look like. How can we create? We'll never achieve the perfection of God's kingdom here on earth, but shouldn't we be working towards that goal? And that's not in the thinking of Christian Zionists. No, it's basically to allow the situation here to continue to perpetuate itself, and to become violent. And somehow they see that as, that Jesus must be, that Jesus' second coming is imminent, because just look how horrible it is in Jerusalem. And so the bloodshed just continues. And they just sort of sit and, it's a sickness that I can't understand, but it's true.
We have one person who says he has a short question. So
It's really the follow-on to the demographic push to see where things are going in the next 20 years. I mean, you probably know better than we. 25 years ago, it was probably 6.8 million Israelis and 5 million Palestinians. In 20 more years, when it's 10.5 million Palestinians and 6.8, because they're like Westerners in their family building and so forth. I mean, that's the old enemy within issue. And
Yes.
that makes it seem like a one-party state where there's 75% of the people, or no, 65, 70 are Palestinian and 40 are Israeli, that it's just pushing the ball down the road. And they have to have their own place somewhere. That's why it's like our place.
And it's not just the population demographics, because I have also noticed in the I arrived here in 2017 again, so I've been here 5 years, 6 years. I'm also, the changes on the ground are staggering in terms of the building, the construction, the roads. The land and the landscape itself is disappearing. And of course, what happens with that is the quality of everybody's life goes down because of it. I mean, Israel sees it as development. Israel sees it as building the land of Israel. But what I see is that the landscape itself is rapidly being diminished. And you add to that climate change. Every year it gets hotter and hotter. In January, it was quite warm. Today, it's quite cold. It's the 30th of April, and it was chilly. And yesterday, we actually had rain, a little bit of rain, which is very unusual, although we'll take any drop of rain we can get here. So it's getting hotter and hotter. So the issue of water, where is the water going to come from? It used to be that Israel's water came largely from the Sea of Galilee. It was the largest freshwater reservoir for Israel. Now there's more water that's being desalinated from the Mediterranean Sea than comes from the Sea of Galilee. So that's become a reality, because there's not a lot of fresh water, not only for Israel. It's not just an Israeli issue. It's a Palestinian issue. It's a Jordanian issue. It's a regional issue. And so climate change, the stresses that both populations are adding to coexist together and to live on this very small space, because the size of Israel is about the state of Delaware, as I understand it. So we're talking about a very, very small geographic area of the world. So how much larger or how much more in terms of population can this area absorb? And I often say this with Israel continuing to expand its settlements in the West Bank, is that where do they think the water is going to come from in the next 10, 20, 30 years? When you have drier winters and less rainfall. Now, the final thing I'm going to say about that is the phenomenon that's happening in Israel. And I think this past Saturday night was the 17th or 18th Saturday night that there were protests in Israel over the current Israeli government wanting to diminish the powers of its own Supreme Court. And people are coming out by the thousands and demonstrating in the streets. But there are Israelis that are actively talking about emigrating or picking up and leaving because the quality of their life, what they see as an eroding of their democratic values. I personally think there's a problem between talking about a Jewish state and a democratic Jewish state.
Yeah.
But this is something that Israelis are even saying to themselves, that I don't recognize this country, and that if Netanyahu gets by with this and does diminish the Supreme Court's powers and therefore allowing one person or several people in the Knesset to decide the law, and that the Supreme Court does not have the right to reinterpret that. And we're also seeing this in terms of, there's a saying that Jerusalem prays and Tel Aviv plays. And Tel Aviv is known for being a very gay-friendly, gay, transgender, lesbian, a very open and welcoming city. And we've even seen in the last several weeks some very violent actions taken against the homosexual community in Tel Aviv. That's also been very frightening and eye-opening to many Israelis, because they saw Tel Aviv as an opening or as an open city and as a welcoming city, and now they're seeing that even within these circles of the government, there's persecution and there's deliberate persecution of that community. And Israeli friends have told me that I have a second passport and I'm ready to go. So, and how is that going to affect the demographics? If you have a significant portion of Israelis who no longer feel that they can be at home in what was supposed to be the Jewish state for the Jewish people. It's a very long answer to your question. I'm sorry.
No, that's right.
No, thank you. We could be here for hours because this is, as we said, so complex and chaotic. Thank you for your time. We will keep you in our prayers. We will sign up for your quarterly newsletter. Please stay in touch with Doug that way. And
I will. And if you and please, if some of you want to come on a really good trip, think about signing up for our February-March Mosaic of Peace trip.
thank you.
Thank you so
It's
much.
very intriguing. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Welcome.